Good day, everyone. Andreas and myself, Kristien Hens, we are very happy to talk to you today about our ideas about experimental philosophy of medicine. The ideas we will be presenting today and also the projects we will be presenting today are part of the neuroepigenetics project. And neuroepigenetics is an ERC-funded project, which means it's funded by a European grant, in which we try to study how dynamic concepts of biology influence how we think about responsibility in the context of neurological conditions such as Tourette, ADHD, and autism. That's a lot to say, but we in this project we have several sub-projects. One of this is doing qualitative research with people with the diagnosis of Tourette, ADHD, and autism, and another project is kickstarting experimental philosophy of medicine. Now, I'm Kristien Hens. I am a professor in bioethics from the University of Antwerp. This is Andreas de Blok.
I'm a philosophy professor at KU Leuven, also Belgian University. And since we're doing experimental philosophy of medicine, we also involve we critique traditional philosophy of medicine. And traditional philosophy of medicine is concerned with many issues, with many debates. It involves debates on concepts of disease, disability, and related concepts such as disorder, health. Also part of philosophy of medicine are rather traditional philosophy of science approaches to randomized control trials, meta-analysis and their value, and on the evidence that is used in evidence-based medicine. What constitutes evidence? Why is evidence-based medicine actually superior to other types of medicine? And what are these other types of medicine? Etc.
Now, what is experimental philosophy in general? You may have already wondered, how do philosophers know what they claim to know? And in the 20th century, a methodology that is used by philosophers, is still used of course, is conceptual analysis. And what is conceptual analysis? You try to subdivide the concept under question, for example, knowledge, into several sub-concepts that completely cover the original concept. For example, you can say knowledge is justified through belief. And the idea is then that you assume that all instances of knowledge can also be described by justified through belief. And how do you know whether your conceptual analysis has worked? Well, this is tested by this is often tested by what is called the method of cases, by using specific stories, specific cases that are supposed to elucidate intuitions about, for example, a specific concept such as knowledge. Now, for example, you can imagine that someone tells you a story about people knowing stuff, and that you're supposed to have this intuition about, oh yes, indeed, this is justified. In this case, it is not knowledge is not the same as justified through belief. Now, there has been a lot of reaction to this method of cases. And there have been a lot of questions about the method of cases. For example, we can ask ourselves, whose intuition should we trust? If we're using cases to elicit certain intuitions, are only the intuitions of philosophers that count, or also the intuitions of non-philosophers? Do they even have the same intuitions, or do they have different intuitions? When can we actually trust intuitions? Can we just assume that intuitions guide us to what is truth? For example, in normative claims, can we just trust our intuitions to actually know what is good and what is wrong? Etc. The cases are also often artificial. You don't control how people interpret certain stories. You don't know with what background they look at it. And an important question is also whether these intuitions that are elicited by the method of cases, whether they are really generalizable. Do people from different gender, from different cultures, from different races, and under different circumstances, do they all have the same intuitions, or do intuitions differ? And since the beginning of the 21st century, philosophers have tried to find this out through experiments. They have started to use empirical methods from psychology and from sociology to try to answer philosophical questions.
So to summarize, for a very long time, philosophers just assumed that their intuitions were generally shared, so not just shared by philosophers, but basically by everyone, and that hence their intuitions were the ones that mattered for philosophical debates. From the beginning of the 21st century onwards, philosophers started to question that idea. Yeah? And one of the methods, probably the main method to question those traditional approaches, was the experimental method used in experimental philosophy. And there the idea was, what we're going to do is to do empirical research, not just experimental empirical research, but also experimental empirical research regarding those human intuitions that matters for philosophical debates.
Now, what kind of methods do experimental philosophers use? In the beginning, many experimental philosophers used surveys and vignettes. Vignettes are little stories that are used to elicit responses to these scenarios in the vignettes. So these were mostly quantitative empirical methods. Later on, people have started to use different methods. For example, Joshua Green has used fMRI to look at which part of your brain lights up when you're confronted with a specific scenario, with a specific vignette. Is it the part of your brain that's mostly associated with emotions or with rationality? Recently, philosophers have also started to use methods from corpus linguistics. These are computational methods with which you can get statistical information from corpora of, for example, common language. You can use this to look at in which context do specific words occur. For example, you could look at in which context does the word know or knowledge occur, and then see whether this can teach us something about what knowledge or what to know actually is.
So far, such experimental approaches have been applied to every philosophical subdomain. Kristien already discussed the case of knowledge as justified through belief, and experimental philosophers have checked whether those intuitions that underlie many of the crucial thought experiments and the conclusions based on those thought experiments in epistemology. But experimental philosophy has also focused on philosophy of language, for instance, on philosophical theories of proper names. Experimental methods have been applied to traditional debates in moral philosophy, such as the compatibility of determinism and personal responsibility. In philosophy of science, experiments have been done on core concepts of our philosophical scientific terminology, such as explanation and cause, and so on and so forth. But up till, let's say, a year ago, there was no or almost no experimental philosophy of medicine. And that's where Kristien comes in.
We believe that experimental methods offer certain opportunities for philosophy of medicine. For example, we believe that it will be very interesting to use experimental philosophy to query intuitions regarding concepts of disease. We've already discussed how philosophers of medicine have performed conceptual analysis on disease. What is actually disease? What is actually health, etc., etc. With experimental methods, we could, for example, look for cross-cultural differences in how health and disease are conceived. We believe this is important for medical practice. A medical doctor is confronted with patients from different backgrounds. Understanding differences in how people think about health and disease may help medical practice. We also believe that it will be interesting to understand differences in intuitions between, for example, medical professionals and their patients. between medical practitioners and clinical researchers. For example, maybe understanding for what a medical practitioner means by a genetic disease and what a clinical researcher means by a genetic disease can shed some light on the differences between these two conceptualizations. Also, of course, we are interested, maybe interesting to understand differences between intuitions between philosophers and lay people. Maybe philosophers of medicine have come up with lots of interesting theories about disease and health, but they may not completely correspond with the intuitions of lay people. Specifically, we believe that also normative intuitions will be interesting to investigate using experimental methods. For example, it has been known that if a symptom is explained using a somatic explanation, referring to something that's going on in your body, or using a psychological explanation, this leads to some differences in how, for example, people look at what is the correct treatment. For symptoms that are somatically explained, people may have the intuition that in this case, certain drugs are more appropriate. Whereas in cases of psychological explanations, people may have the intuition that in this case, other kinds of treatment are more appropriate. Another interesting topic of investigation is the topic of responsibility. Who is responsible for individual health? Is this the person? Is this the collective? And so on and so on. All these aspects we believe are interesting topics for that experiments can be done about.
So within the experimental philosophy of medicine part of the neuroepigenetics project, there are several sub-projects, and one of these sub-projects is concerned with what we have called ontologies of disease. So what is a disease, and how and why does it differ from health? What is the difference between a healthy condition and a diseased condition? Obviously, that issue has been of central importance to most, or at least a lot, of philosophy of medicine. One of the questions that is asked in traditional conceptual analysis of disease is whether the environment impacts our disease judgment. Means that according to some philosophers, our disease judgment is environmentally relative, and according to others, it isn't. So according to some philosophers, you can only be dyslexic in a literate society. According to other philosophers, you can be dyslexic both in a literate society and in an illiterate society, even though in an illiterate society, even those philosophers have to admit that you do not have the symptoms or do not suffer from being dyslexic. That question, though, has never been addressed with experimental methods. Yeah, and that's what we try to do in this sub-project. We try to probe the intuitions of lay people, many stakeholders in medicine, including doctors, medically trained professionals, patients, the general public, and see whether their intuitions are that disease judgments are environmentally relative or not. The second sub-project revolves around whether the cause or the cure of a particular condition influences our disease attribution. Now, that is a debate that is mostly neglected by philosophers. And why is it neglected by philosophers? Because according to philosophers, it is clear that what something is, the ontology of a particular thing, is independent of what causes it. So people do not have to know what the cause is of a particular condition to know whether it is a disease or not. Now, what we wanted to know was whether this is also true for lay people, whether or not the disease judgment of lay people is influenced by the fact that a condition is caused by, say, either an accident or a gene or an infection or some environmental factor. So that's the issue that we address in that second part. Now, what you see here are vignettes that we use for the first part of our Ontologies of Disease project that revolves around the environmental relativity of our disease judgment.
So, as you've heard, we believe that an experimental approach to philosophy of medicine has many opportunities. But of course, with many opportunities also come great challenges. And we've already met some of these challenges while thinking about our experimental setup for ontologies of disease study. And one challenge that we met is that concepts in medicine, like disease, like illness, that we think that they are not merely, that we cannot merely approach them only by conceptual analysis and testing of intuition. So disease and illness, we cannot merely try to divide them in sub-concepts and see if we can create these kind of sub-concepts that completely cover the concept of disease or the concept of health. That is because these concepts also have performative and normative aspects. If you say, for example, being very afraid of snakes is a disease, you are not only defining being afraid of snakes as a disease, you're actually doing something more. You're actually stating that being afraid of snakes is, first of all, something bad, something that you better not have, and secondly, that it's something that maybe you could go to the doctor about. So these performative and normative aspects of these concepts in medicine pose some challenges for experimental philosophy. So we believe that these challenges can be tackled by, for example, by incorporating corpus methods into the research into these concepts. Secondly, disease and illness are concepts that always have an aspect of, that also always have some idiosyncratic aspects. They always have this aspect of what does this mean to me? Besides generalizing how the population, how many people think about of disease and illness, because of the nature of medicine, also what health and disease means for a specific person in a specific circumstance is very informative and should, we believe, be part of the analysis as much as the generalizations that you can do based on vignette studies, for example. So next to purely quantitative research, we believe that in order to really understand these concepts, a mixed method approach combining quantitative and qualitative methods may be the way forward. So we believe that for the future directions of experimental philosophy of medicine, we believe that corpus methods can be very interesting to query natural uses of terms. For example, Boers, he made a difference between illness and disease, but it will be interesting to look at corpora of actual common language, whether illness and disease are in fact used in different contexts, whether they have slightly different meanings. Such corpora, such corpus methods can also be used, by the way, to ask meta questions about the discipline. We could make corpora of clinical research or corpora of writings in philosophy of medicine or corpora in bioethics, and then ask certain questions about these disciplines. For example, what is the concept of disability? How is disability used in bioethics literature? Is it mainly seen as something bad, as something to be avoided, or do they also have other connotations? How do authors in philosophy of medicine talk about genes, for example? Do they see genes as very predictive, and so on and so on? So that's one thing. Next, we also believe in incorporating qualitative research also to better understand the results of quantitative research and to understand values and idiosyncratic experiences of people with a specific disease, with an illness, with health, etc.
We conclude our presentation with an overview of things we are doing and we will do in the near future. We already talked about the Ontologies of Disease project. Emma Moorman, who's a PhD student working with Kristien, is currently doing experimental research on the thought experiments of Derek Parfit, a famous philosopher, and those intuitions revolve around our responsibility for future people. Emma involves in her research also deaf people to research their intuitions on disability and deafness. Jo Bervoets, also a PhD student with Kristien, does experimental research on responsibility and blame in the context of neurodevelopmental disorders, thereby primarily focusing on Tourette's syndrome. And Kristien is working with Charles Spence, a philosophy professor at the University of Louvain-la-Neuve, also in Belgium. They're doing corpus analysis of bioethical texts.
But besides doing these studies ourselves, we also wanted to create a platform to increase the study of the experimental study of philosophy of medicine, and therefore we are editing a special issue in the Journal of Theoretical Medicine and Bioethics on experimental philosophy of medicine. This will appear in the beginning of 2021. And also we are editing an edited volume in the Advances in Experimental Philosophy series by Bloomsbury, and this will appear in the beginning of 2022. Okay, thank you, and
goodbye.
Goodbye.